Good morning, everyone. Just give me a second to get everything lined up. Hopefully you can see that all right. Go. And 4. Out. That should. What? And all right. Placement of things look a little differently this morning, or sorry, afternoon. But that's because we're going to handle things a little differently. This is going to be our final in the series on suffering. I slightly misjudged, but I warned you at the outset. I couldn't always get the timing down predictably. I was hoping that we could have finished this up last week, but we couldn't. So even though it is now the month of Adar, Chodesh Tov to everyone, which is a month of happiness and joy, we're still going to be talking about suffering for just this last Wednesday. I promise that for the next couple of classes, we will be looking at more lighthearted themes in order to stay within the theme of Adar, the theme of joy. It's the month of Purim, after all. But what I wanted to do today is to sort of provide a bit of a synthesis of everything that we have been learning together over these many weeks. Now, I could have put this together at the very beginning, but it would have been quite incomprehensible. And I will warn everybody, if you have not yet studied through all of the videos I have done so far, some parts of this may seem a bit confusing or perhaps even offensive. It's only within the full context of everything we've studied that what we're going to look at today will make sense. So with that in mind, let me describe what we'll be doing. What I have done is taken the different lessons from the different sections of Talmud, of Tanakh, of rabbinic teachings, of other sources, and put them together into a flowchart. Now, is anybody's personal experience of suffering really subject to sterile analysis? No, of course not. However, upon reflection, in many instances, we can often find helpful and instructive insights by going through the steps that our different texts of our tradition have explained. Now, I will give a brief outline of each step, but really each one is best reinforced by all of the texts that we have already studied over these months. So don't expect this to be 100% repeat of every point that's been made, and don't expect it to be 100% justification of every point that's been made. That's what the many hours we have already spent is designed to do. This instead is more of a recap of how it all fits together and a bit of a instruction of how we could use it for our own reflection. And let me just repeat that: for our own reflection. As we saw from the outset, most acutely with the Friends of Job, but repeated multiple times by our sages and other texts, this is not here to tell us why someone else is suffering. This is here to tell us what we should do when we feel like we are suffering. That is to say, you individually, the singular pronoun I, what should I do? No one is in a position to tell somebody else what it is, although obviously providing advice and guidance when sought and in a way that is compassionate and constructive rather than insulting or harmful, of course. But that is the main idea here. This is for personal introspection and reflection. And as we'll see throughout this chart, the same way we did throughout all of our lessons, the undeniable fact that suffering occurs, and that suffering occurs to people for multiple reasons, some of which they deserve, and some of which they absolutely do not, again, highlighted in the story of Job. The fact that suffering is universal means that no one outside of the person's experience, and no one less than God, truly understands every aspect and element to what a person is going through, which is why we provide compassion and support rather than criticism and condemnation. But for the self, there is something useful to be gained by going through the steps of this personal reflection. And one of those things is to also recognize that, well, we'll get there. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and do it step by step as I originally intended. Okay, so we're going to start off with our first point here. I feel like I am suffering, right? At different times, perhaps often, this feeling will occur to us. I feel like there's something wrong. There is something bad. There is something that is making me sad, something making me hurt, something making me struggle in a way that I feel is not right. So what do I need to do? Well, the first thing I need to ask is this really suffering? Now, that question may seem counterintuitive because I've spent an awful lot of time over these months arguing that suffering is real. It's literally the name of the course on the flyer in the sanctuary or in the synagogue. But when we reflect on our own suffering, we are in a perspective to be a bit more honest. We have talked about how the Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination, can often create a perception of suffering even where what is occurring is not actually suffering. The famous example from Rambam is somebody who is eating off silver plates, feeling terrible because they don't have gold plates. Now, is eating off silver plates suffering? No. Does it feel like suffering if you have given in to your sense of jealousy, your sense of status seeking, your sense of greed? Absolutely, it feels like suffering. So the first stop in our discussion of our own suffering is to see whether or not what it is that we are complaining about, what it is that is bothering us, is generated by our Yetzer Hara or is generated in some other manner. If it is generated by our Yetzer Hara, well, then we need to confront our Yetzer Hara. We need to take a breath. We need to re-examine our priorities. We need to understand what it is that or how it is that the Yetzer Hara has fooled us, what delusion it's created for us. And with that, we can then free ourselves of that feeling of suffering that comes about because of the delusion that our Yetzer Hara, our inclination towards bad, can sometimes create. So that's step number one. Is what I'm actually experiencing really suffering? And sometimes we are overtuned to this, not just status seeking. Sometimes any frustration feels like a nightmare. I can't believe the light went red. I can't believe that guy is driving 45 miles an hour when I want to go 47. There's all sorts of ways that we can trick ourselves through the Yetzer Hara into doing things or into feeling like our life is full of misery, when in fact our life is perfectly fine. But the Yetzer Hara is not in the business of making us feel fine. It's in the business of making us feel bad for its own reasons, as we discussed in some detail. And therefore, we've got to do a quick check to make sure whatever it is that's bothering us isn't just our Yetzer Hara having its way. Okay, but assuming that it is real, we move on to our next step. The next step is to ask ourselves, did I sin? Yes, I have said from the outset that not all suffering is punishment. And unfortunately, many people will take this question and immediately answer it yes without actual reflection. That is not what our tradition is telling us to do. Our tradition doesn't tell us to just feel nebulously guilty all the time for everything, even if it's not really a problem. No, some of us may feel that way, and that's something that we can work on. And maybe this decision point will help. Because if we are going to say that I sinned, you have to be able to name it. You have to be able to put into words what it is that you have done, that you feel was wrong, and that has generated this type of situation that you are now suffering through. If you can't name the mistake, if you can't say, well, there was that time I stole $500 from my boss. If you can't say, well, there was that time as the boss that I cheated my employee out of $500 on his paycheck. If you can't come up with a statement of what you did that was wrong, that you could then do teshuvah for, to repent, to amend, to fix it, fix the implication as well as fix doing it again, then you're not actually admitting to a sin. You're just saying, I am worthy of punishment in some generic way. And Judaism does not go in for generic guilt. It goes in for specific. And yes, that sometimes can make us feel a little bit neurotic, but The upside is, if you can't actually name the sin, then you really shouldn't be thinking that your punishment, that the suffering you have is a punishment for that unnamed sin, right? The whole point of sin as punishment is to, one, yes, punish for what we did, but it is more importantly trying to guide us and direct us towards a remedy. You may remember the few examples we saw in our discussion regarding this, that when somebody realizes their mistake, such as the rabbi who was not properly dealing with his sharecropper, when he realizes that mistake, he remedies it. That's the point. The point isn't to just say, oh, woe is me, I'm a sinner. The point is to say, wow, this is what happens when you sin, and this is what I did. I need to fix it. I need to repent. I need to ask for forgiveness from God as well as anyone I might have harmed, and I need to fix that harm. And then not only will my sin be taken care of, but the problem that is attached to it will also go away. So this is an incredibly important point, not just because it helps us admit our mistakes, but because it helps us recognize that if we don't have a clearly identifiable mistake, we should not blame our suffering on ourselves as punishment. Too often people say, why am I being punished? When it feels to me from the outside, from everything they've shared, that they don't have anything in mind that would possibly explain what they're experiencing as being punishment. And if we can't get past that, if we think that everything is punishment, but we don't know what we did to deserve it, then not only are we unable to fix this imagined error, but we're also unable to learn how to cope with the suffering that isn't because of our sin. And learning how to cope with suffering when it's not our fault in that narrow sense of a sin is very, very important, and something that the rest of this chart is going to deal with. Because, well, the answer could be no, right? Very often, the sin that we are, the punishment, the suffering, that's the English. The suffering that we are dealing with is not because of a particular sin. And again, if you need reinforcement of that, go back to the book of Job. The whole point of the setup of that story is that Job was not sinning. So therefore, we know somebody can suffer and still be blameless, which means the chart has to continue in that way. The next thing the Talmud discussed was, well, maybe I didn't sin per se. I didn't actually fail to do a commandment or break a commandment, but perhaps I have been negligent in my study of Torah. Perhaps I have not been as diligent in learning more than I already know. As we talked about during that class, this does not mean spending 24/7 with your nose in a book, but it does mean constantly progressing, constantly exposing ourselves to new ideas and deepening our understanding so that we can live a good life. Indeed, the study of Torah is what we're engaged in right now. So the question is, okay, I didn't actually do a specific sin, but have I been negligent and delinquent in my studies? Well, if the answer is yes, we're not done. There are still two more questions we have to get through. One, is the suffering excessive? If the suffering is excessive, then it is not because of my neglect of Torah. Yes, I still may need to study more, but I cannot pin this suffering on my negligence of Torah, because this suffering is too enormous to be a possible remedial punishment for my neglect of Torah. So therefore, if the suffering is truly excessive, it is not a suffering because of the Torah, which means we're going to go back to that chart. But even if we feel the suffering is not truly excessive, meaning it's not that excessive, so we're moving on in our chart to the no, we still have to ask, does the suffering prevent study and or prayer? Because of this particular type of illness or problem, am I actually being, is it actually harder for me to engage in prayer or to find time to study? And if the answer is yes, then this is not a suffering that is brought about due to negligence of Torah. And we go back to the core of the chart. If the answer is no, meaning that it's not excessive suffering, and the particular problem I have is not interfering with my ability to study or pray. It's an annoyance, it's a problem, but it's not actually preventing me from engaging in more study and prayer. And I do feel, honestly, that I have been derelict in my study of Torah. Then this indeed could be suffering brought about due to negligence. And therefore, the remedy is rather obvious. Talmud Torah, study more, learn more. Again, this does not mean that you have to go into a rabbinic program. This does not mean that you have to quit your job and study in yeshiva full time. This just means you need to increase. Make sure you're reading the parashah each week. Make sure that you are studying a little halacha or a little midrash or a little bit of Jewish history or Jewish culture. There are so many different ways to engage that will alleviate this stress. And as a not coincidental side benefit, the more that we study Torah, the more we can avoid some of the sins that we mentioned in the previous step and avoid some of the other problems we'll see in the later steps. And we will, of course, find the wellspring from which to draw strength for when we deal with types of suffering that are not as easily remedied. And we will see more about those a little bit further down. Okay, so let's imagine then that I didn't neglect Torah, which means I moved down the chart, or I've neglected it some, but the suffering is way too disproportionate or is way too disruptive, and therefore I'm still not going to attribute this to neglect of Torah. I'm going to increase my Talmud Torah, but I'm not going to expect my study to alleviate all my suffering, because if I answered yes to these two questions, or either of these questions, then I know that the true source of this suffering cannot be my neglect of Torah. Okay, so now we've got the tricky one. I have realized this is not due to a sin, and this is not due to neglect of Torah, either because I haven't neglected Torah or because it is disproportionate and intrusive. In that case, I am told that I should ask myself the question, do I desire the reward from this suffering? You may remember we discussed this idea at some length with trying to wrap our heads around the idea that in this world and the worlds to come, there is a ledger, there is a balance sheet. And when we do something right, we will be given a reward, either in this world or the next. And when we do something wrong, we will be given a punishment, either in this world or the next. And that means that everything will eventually balance out. However, if we've done nothing wrong and we are punished, meaning we are enduring suffering, well, that will build up a balance, a credit to our spiritual life that will eventually be cashed in the worlds to come. And if that is the case, we have to accept it. And this, again, was something that we looked at a number of different stories from the Talmud with the rabbis being sick. And is the suffering dear to you and its reward? And as we saw routinely, the answer was no. Nobody wants to suffer. And that's okay. The rabbis left this as a hypothetical that someone could claim that the type of suffering they are enduring, which they can not attribute to their own misdeeds or some of the later categories, as we'll see, that we can call that Isurim Ahava, that these are sufferings of love, and you can go through them peacefully and know that you will eventually be building up a surplus of reward that will come back to you in Olam Haba, in the worlds to come. But critically, no one can tell you just put up with it because this is God loving you, right? That is offensive and terrible to say to anyone. And you are under no obligation and will not be praised for choosing to interpret it this way either. You can, but the likely outcome in one of these situations is to feel like you'd like the suffering to go away and you're not really keen on any reward that it might bring. This is what we saw again and again in the stories in the Talmud, where rabbis were given that option and they all say, no, I don't want this or its reward. Please make the hurting stop. So this is a technical explanation for some types of suffering, but it is not one that should be the norm. It is not one that should be mystified, not one that should be held up as being the true ideal. We are not inclined to try and breed martyrdom like this. It is there because for some people in certain niche situations, it is a useful way to approach the suffering they are experiencing, but this is not meant to be the best explanation, which means we have to move on. Oh, let's see if I can get this balanced here. There we go. Trying to do it one line at a time. So if we are going to follow the rabbinic example, and when we have decided this was not due to a sin, this was not due to neglect of Torah, and we are not keen on any reward from this, and so we're going to answer no, do I desire the reward? Then the next question we need to ask, is this suffering the result of being material? I'm a physical creature. I live in a physical world. I believe someone even made a song about being a material girl in the material world. And in that circumstance, we discussed things are going to break. You're going to have the potential for a broken bone. You're going to have the potential for cancer, God forbid. You're going to have the potential for COVID. Because we are living within the laws of a physical world, all of the physical materials that we are made of can break, they can wear out, they can interact in ways that will create a feeling of badness, of suffering for us. So if I can identify that the particular suffering I am enduring right now is generated because I am a physical creature, then I have to ask myself another question. Is it fixable? Right? I've broken my leg. All right. Why did I break my leg? Well, I already ruled out punishment. I ruled out that this was neglect of Torah. I'm not calling this Isuri Mahava. This is not a loving break. But I am reassured that I can fix it. Right? Broken legs are generally the kind of things that can be fixed. And therefore, we go to the doctor patches it up, it gets better, and we're good. We don't have to say that this was any kind of punishment. We don't have to say this was any kind of malice. We just have to recognize that this sort of thing will happen from time to time, as long as we are material bodies, as long as we are bumping around inside this giant terrarium of life. And we should be thankful when we can find things like that are fixable. However, not everything can be fixed. We have made huge progress. We are getting better and better at finding fixes for most of the physical ailments that we have. And this is something that we should be incredibly proud of as a species. It is something that we should all be supporting, both nationally and globally, because the discovery of cures anywhere in the world alleviates suffering everywhere in the world. But we also recognize that at any given point in time, there are some types of suffering that simply cannot be fixed with our current understanding of how to fix things. Now, while we still hope for it to be fixed, and we can still pray for guidance and for miracles and all of that, how do we contextualize that suffering for ourselves? Well, there are three not mutually exclusive ways of looking at it, and they do not apply to every situation. So so your choice here is going to involve a little bit of self-wisdom, or in discussing it with others in a compassionate way. So the first, of course, is to say, well, this is what it is, right? Imagine you lived 400 years ago and you broke your leg and it didn't heal properly, and now your leg just is sore all the time. Well, that's what I get for being a human body. I don't have to take this as being punishment. I don't have to take this as being somehow deserved. I can just say, look, I'm a human body bumping around in the world, breaks happen, this break happened, and I'm just going to have to put up with it. Nowadays, that would also allow us to put up with having to use crutches for a while, or maybe a wheelchair, or going to the physical therapy or other forms of rehab. I'm just going to endure it because this is something I need to do. And if I never fully recover, well, I'm not going to give up because I don't feel oppressed by this particular problem. I am simply, in very, very heavy quotes, simply going to have to suffer through it. That's all. That's the only option I've got. Now, That's not the only option of how I can reflect on it, however. I can also reflect on it with Gamze Lavor, right? This too shall pass, meaning that whatever physical problem I'm having, I can look at it with a sense of optimism that eventually this will get better. Yes, right now I'm having trouble, with my guts, for example, and it's really, really bad, but eventually this will pass. And I can look forward to a time when this physical ailment will be alleviated and everything's going to feel better. And I can also look forward to a time when they will have cured this, or my body will have adjusted, or any number of other ways that this particular issue can pass. Likewise, I can also say, well, maybe it's for the best. This is very hard. And remember, again, this is something that only the person who is going through the suffering can conclude. Like when we read about the story of Joseph, Joseph was the one who had to say, it was best that you sold me into slavery, because if his brothers had said that, it would have meant that they were not actually repentant of what they had done. But for ourselves, we can say, you know what? I really wish I hadn't broken my leg, but since I did, I can now spend a little bit more time reading something that I've been wanting to read that I kept putting off because I was running around all the time. Or perhaps I can find a way to think better about my life and what I'm doing because of this crisis. Perhaps I can find strength in myself through my recovery that will give me strength for other things outside of it. Perhaps it will have prevented me from some other catastrophe happening. Maybe the breaking of the leg was the better version of whatever that situation was. Let's call it a car crash. And I could have died. And so this suffering is in fact an improved version of the catastrophe that I could have endured. There are many ways to reflect on this being more positive than it appears. But again, very important reminder, this is something for a person to reflect upon for themselves. It is not for you to tell somebody else this is how they should look at it. It is up to each person to find that betterness, the bestness, benefit. That's probably the best word, to find the benefit for themselves. We can provide support and an understanding ear, but very, very dangerous to try and tell somebody else why you think it's better, because only they can make that calculation of whether they truly think it was a balance. Now, as I said, all three of these can work simultaneously, or an individual can focus on one more than the other, and they are not mutually contradictory. Okay, but let's imagine we go back to our chart, that the problem I'm dealing with is not the result of being material. All right, let's say that I am suffering because of some problem at my job. There's somebody at the work that's making my life just a nightmare. And that's not because I'm material, right? They're not punching me. And even if they were punching me, they're still choosing to punch me. It's not just a random failing of the body. It's someone's fist at the other end. So this problem is not really just because I'm a material creature. It is because someone else is causing it. So if someone else is causing it, then I have to go through my chart again. And if someone else is causing it, then I have to ask, can I stop them or can I prevent the harm? Right? So go back to your my work example, somebody that's stealing the credit for your work. Okay. Can you stop them from doing that? Well, there might be steps you can take. Perhaps you can put passwords on your files. Perhaps you can talk to a boss. Perhaps you can find some other means of preventing them from doing it. And that will alleviate the problem. And if you can fix it, then by all means, fix it. Again, you'll note throughout so many of these, the point of the suffering is not to suffer. The point of the suffering is eventually to fix it and make things better for yourself, for others, for everyone. That's the point of our life, is we're trying to make things a little better. So if you can fix it, fix it. You don't have to be a martyr to the cause if you're able to defeat the problem. But as we all know, there are sometimes problems that cannot be fixed. You can't change your job because you are desperate for the health insurance because you keep breaking your leg, or you are unable to find something else in your field, or there is some other problem that prevents you from resolving this issue. And it's going to continue happening. And you don't have an option to fix now. This is very careful. You have to not have an option to fix it. Not you're choosing not to fix it because I don't want to cause a fuss or because I don't think it's important enough or whatever, right? Enduring something or having these other perspectives on it when you could easily and positively remedy the problem is not earning you brownie points with God. Right? You're not a better person for putting up with something that could be fixed. But we do know that there are sometimes situations where you can't stop the harm. You can't stop someone else's behavior. So many times in our history, we have been in a situation where we have somebody like Haman or any of the other despots and tyrants and pirates and bandits and others that have done harm to our people over the millennia. And we have often not been able to do anything. Thankfully, the holiday of Purim coming up, we remind ourselves that sometimes we can. But historically, there have been a whole lot of times when we really couldn't do anything about it. And so we are left with our resolution again. We can endure it and recognize that we can draw strength from our tradition, from our community, and from ourselves in order to get through this problem. We can also take solace in the fact that the types of problems that this is eventually do all pass away. The tyrants of the world, as well as the petty office politics, eventually go away. They eventually do pass, if only because people engaged in it usually either get fired or move out of our sphere. One way or another, usually that problem does eventually resolve itself. Again, if we can fix it, we do. But if we can't, we can take some solace in knowing that it will pass. And likewise, sometimes we can find that silver lining. We can look for what is best because of the situation. What have we gained from the situation where if the suffering had not occurred, we would have missed it. And sometimes we can at least find a modicum of relief in that reflection. Again, no one tells anyone else how to do this. This is for our own self-reflection. Now, having gone through all of this, and I want to do a quick review before we get to the very bottom one, right? Is my suffering actually real, or is it my yetzer hara, my inclination to evil, playing tricks on me? Did I actually sin? Well, yes, then fix it. But if not, then it's not your fault. But did I neglect Torah? Well, yes. But if the suffering is excessive or it prevents study and prayer, then you shouldn't consider it as being punishment for that. But in any case, learning a little more never hurts. Do I desire the reward for this unattributable suffering that is occurring in my life? If you actually do, and you're under no obligation to, then yes, you can call it Isuri Mahava, and you can enjoy the reward in the world to come. But if, like most people, you do not want that reward and would rather the suffering went away, then reflect, is this just a part of being a human being? The cycle of life and death, the cycle of health and illness. Then look to see if it's fixable, do everything we can to remedy it. But if we can't, take solace, take strength, know that it will pass, and know that even in the worst circumstances, there is often something positive to be gained. Likewise, if it's not because I'm material, but because someone else is being bad, and I am a victim of their right to free will, then I will look for ways to stop them, to prevent that harm, to insulate myself, and to eventually get them to stop that behavior. I will look to fix it. And until I can, or if I can't, then I will rely on, again, my strength, the strength of God, the strength of my community and my tradition, my knowledge that this is a temporary situation and is going to disappear into the folds of history, and that even in this terrible situation, there is something that I can find to gain from it. Again, fix it if you can, but have that as an element of support throughout that process. Now, what's left? if it's not because I'm material, and if it's not because someone else is causing it, and it's not because I have sinned or done anything else, and I certainly haven't chosen it as being part of my my reward package, well, what would be left on the chart? Well, what's left on the chart is to ask yourself, am I causing it? Now, I know that we began with, did I sin? But this is different, right? Sin is a defined infraction. You stole from somebody, you lie, you have defrauded somebody. Those are mitzvot in the Torah that you have violated. If you have violated them, we're back up on stage one. Due to Shuvah, stage two technically, stage one was the Yetzer Hara tricking you, but stage two, you are back on dealing with the issue of what you did. But sometimes we do things that aren't sins that still cause us suffering. Let me give you an example. So imagine that you are just suffering every single day in your car on your commute. You are on the I-4, it is bumper to bumper, and it's just you get to work with a headache, and then by the time you get back home, the headache's even worse because spending that time on the I-4 day after day after day, it's just miserable. Well, the question is, have you looked for alternative ways to commute? Have you looked for an alternative job? Have you even examined the opportunity to find something out of this problem, out of this situation? Very often we will allow ourselves to be habituated to decisions that are not sins, but they are also not helping us. They are not bringing us benefit or goodness. And when that occurs, we have an obligation to try and fix them. One of my favorite statistics, to go back to our commute, is that when there is a forced detour, road construction or some other thing that causes people to take a detour for a little bit of time, meaning for multiple days at a time, some 30% will stick with their alternative route after the original obstruction is removed and they could have returned to their original path because they have discovered that their new route is actually more beneficial. It is more optimal than the route they had been taking. But very often we will get stuck in patterns, we will get habituated into behaviors that are causing us to suffer, not necessarily life-ending suffering, although on the I-4 it could be, but things that still create a feeling of unwellness, of unhappiness, and of just sadness that we actually have the ability to remedy. And they're not sins. They're not us being bad. They're just because we often feel overwhelmed and stressed and pressured, we feel like we don't have time or incentive to try and look at some of the things that we do day after day that might be contributing in some small way to the problems that we are currently experiencing. And when we are able to reflect on those, sometimes we can really improve the quality of our life. No, it's not going to take care of cancer. No, it's not going to take care immediately of that guy at the office that's causing all the trouble. But it can still maybe get rid of the headache that you're dealing with. And maybe that'll allow you a little bit more time to enjoy life and to enjoy your family and your community in ways that are currently being deprived of you. The rest still needs to be worked on, but there is much we can do in our own decision making that has nothing to do with sin, nothing to do with good and evil, and certainly nothing to do with punishment that can still provide benefit to ourselves. And that is a critical thing to consider. Rambam talked about this with regards to our free will, but in our discussion there, we focus mainly on choosing to do things that are actual transgressions. Here, I just wanted to really highlight that his discussion would also cover things that we choose to do that are not transgressions, but definitely still take away from that quality of life. But what happens if you go down this entire chart? At every diamond, the answer is no, 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 no. I'm not being tricked by my Yetzer Hara. I didn't sin. I didn't neglect Torah. I don't want any reward from this type of suffering. It's not because I'm a physical being. It's not someone else causing it. And I'm not causing it. But I still feel like there's something terrible, terribly wrong. What do I do then? Well, you obviously can still endure, still say this will pass, and still say that this may be for the best. But ultimately, at this point, you are standing alongside Job, and you are staring into the whirlwind. The end of the book of Job is God speaking to him from that whirlwind and essentially reminding humanity that for all of our charts and for all of the wisdom of our ancestors from 3,000 years, there are things we will never understand in this life. There are things that are beyond our capacity. We can break it down all nice and neat and have this lovely little chart to remind ourselves of every little step that we can reflect upon. But at the end of the day, we are just human. And as we saw in our discussion in the Talmud, even Moses never fully understood why some things happened in some circumstances. And he had a greater capacity and vision than the rest of us. So sometimes we do have to just humbly acknowledge that we will not be able to explain this, and we will not be able to explain it away. That doesn't make it meaningless, and it doesn't make it pointless. It just means this is a glimpse of the infinite that is beyond our comprehension in this life. And while we can still try to fix everything, and we can still look for strength to endure and wisdom to know that it will pass, and the insight to find a benefit in even terrible situations, we also sometimes just have to acknowledge that suffering is going to occur in ways that beggar belief, that are either more monstrous than we could imagine, or more disproportionate than we could ever possibly think to justify as being just, and that we are still not necessarily to blame. That we don't have to believe that this is just unmitigated evil or that the world is out of control. The whirlwind seems as though it is just a blind, wrathful manifestation of chaos. But ultimately, there is a structure behind it all. It's not one that we are privy to, as the end of the book of Job makes very, very clear. But it is one that we can still rely is there. It does exist. There are answers. But as humble humans, we must acknowledge sometimes the limit of our ability to find them. Doesn't mean we give up. As you can see, all the way down this page is looking for things that we can do, ways that we can cope and ways that we can fix. But we have to recognize that even when we've put in all of our effort to fixing everything we can and coping as best as we can, there will be things beyond our understanding. And that isn't satisfying. I warned everybody when we began that this was not going to be a perfectly satisfying explanation for everything. And I mean that when we began this whole class on suffering, not just today. And that's satisfying, at least it is to me, to recognize that there are things in this world that are beyond my understanding, and that's where God truly takes over. That's where God is truly going to be present in a way that I can only guess at. Provides me with a framework for where my faith will lead me, and how I can draw strength from that unknowableness. Because yes, there will be suffering that is incomprehensible, but there will also be blessings that are incomprehensible. Because we could make a complete chart that is exactly like this one, its mirror opposite, that asks, why am I blessed? Why am I happy? Why am I benefiting? And we could go down the same list and eventually come to the conclusion that we don't deserve it, that we don't deserve the good things that we are currently experiencing. It's not because I have made some major mitzvah. It's not because I have studied so much Torah that I'm being rewarded. It's not because I am just a material creature and therefore it's normal for me to have these kinds of things or these experiences. No one else is necessarily there to get credit for the good that they gave me. Sometimes these things just seem to happen. And even I have no part in playing it with my own habits and behaviors. I just have it. I'm just lucky. And to recognize that that too is part and parcel of this universe that we live in is an important opportunity for hope and an important opportunity for truly understanding that, yes, God is beyond us. God is beyond our understanding. And both the blessing as well as the suffering is something that we will never be able to 100% explain or 100% be able to control. And with that, we will have to find our strength and our wisdom, and we will have to support each other to try and create blessing for one another and to try and alleviate suffering wherever possible for ourselves and for each other. And that is our role in this world. And hopefully you have found some strength in our discussion of suffering over these months. Hopefully you have found some insight from the traditions of our people. And hopefully you'll come back with me next Wednesday when we discuss another topic a little more deeply, but a lot more joyfully. So with that, I will bid everyone a wonderful afternoon. Have a good month of Adar, and may happiness increase. And may we see through the miracle of Purim that even the most desperate of situations can often be made better simply by the courage of one person. Take care and be well.